If you were sitting in Paris in the 1540s, the greatest threat to your physical survival wasn't actually some distant, abstract empire.
Right, not at all.
It was the Habsburg dynasty. I mean, this massive European royal house that essentially controlled half the continent through Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. They had France completely surrounded.
Just boxed in.
Yeah, totally boxed in. So who did the French king turn to for his most trusted, powerful military alliance? Who did he invite to actually dock their warships in French ports to keep his people safe?
Yeah, the answer always surprises people.
It was the Muslim Sultan of the Ottoman Empire.
Which is wild, right? Because that specific historical reality completely shatters the neat, clean narrative we're usually taught.
Absolutely.
You know, that whole idea of East versus West, or a united Christian Europe standing firm against an Islamic threat. The geopolitics of the era were infinitely more complex and honestly much more pragmatic.
And that complexity is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're looking past the dusty textbook dates to explore the actual mechanics of a state that bridged Europe, Asia, and Africa from 1299 all the way to 1922.
A really staggering timeline.
Right. We are talking about a society that grew from a scrappy band of Anatolian nomads into a transcontinental superpower spanning over 2 million square miles.
Over 2 million. It's almost hard to visualize.
Okay, let's unpack this, because whether you are drinking a cup of coffee today or, trying to make sense of the modern geopolitical borders in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, you are directly interacting with the echoes of the Ottomans.
You really are. It's baked into everything.
But to understand this massive 600-year entity, we have to start at the beginning. How does a small nomadic tribe capitalize on a completely fractured landscape?
Well, you have to look at the sheer scale of the catastrophe that preceded them. The Ottoman state emerged around 1299 under a Turkoman tribal leader named Osman I.
And his name was later anglicized to Ottoman, right?
Exactly. But the why behind their initial, explosive growth is largely tied to the mid-14th century Black Death.
Oh, wow. Of course.
Yeah, the plague had just devastated the dominant regional power, the Byzantine Empire. Demographically, militarily, economically, the Byzantines were exhausted.
Just completely wiped out.
Right. The plague essentially hollowed out their defenses and cleared a geographical path for early Ottoman expansion.
So the foundation of the empire wasn't necessarily built on some insurmountable military genius from day one. I mean, it was largely about capitalizing on an apocalyptic power vacuum.
That's a great way to put it. And in those early decades, the strategy was highly predatory. Modern historiography refers to this as the Akinci phase.
Akinci, what does that look like on the ground?
Well, the early Ottoman economy relied heavily on continuous slave hunting raids. They were basically plundering weakened Byzantine territories.
Okay.
But, there is a ceiling to that strategy. You cannot sustain a 600-year transcontinental empire purely through raiding.
Yeah, eventually you run out of things to raid.
Exactly. You inevitably have to transition into administrative integration and actual governance. And the ultimate prize of that integration, the real turning point, was Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of Constantinople in 1453.
Which officially ended the Roman or Byzantine era.
It did.
I've always heard those early Ottomans described almost like a highly disruptive startup executing a hostile takeover of a legacy corporation.
Oh, I like that.
But thinking about the actual mechanics of an acquisition, when a tech company buys out an older competitor, they rarely throw out all the legacy backend code if it still processes the data perfectly, right?
Yeah.
They just put a new front-end interface on.
Right. Why break what works?
Exactly. So did the Ottomans actually destroy the Byzantine systems, or did they just absorb that legacy code?
What's fascinating here is that it was the latter, almost entirely. The British historian Norman Stone heavily emphasized this exact point. Yeah, the Ottomans basically adopted the Byzantine and Roman machinery, put on a trickish Muslim guise, and just kept the engine running. We see this in the most fundamental mechanics of statecraft, like land and taxes.
The boring stuff that actually runs a country.
Exactly. The Byzantine land measurement system, which was called the strema, was simply adopted and renamed the Ottoman dönüm, and the Byzantine Zugarian tax on agricultural land.
And let me guess, they kept that too.
They mirrored it almost exactly with the Ottoman Rezimnas sift tax.
Wow. So if you were a peasant farmer, the empire's flag changed, but the exact size of the plot you were taxed on and the mechanism of how that tax was calculated barely shifted.
Barely shifted at all, and it goes even further than agricultural taxes. Stone points out that while Sunni Islam was the state religion, the Ottoman government actively supported and integrated the Eastern Orthodox Church into its power structure.
Wait, really? The Orthodox Church?
Yeah. In return for accepting Ottoman oversight, the Orthodox Church was allowed to retain its vast properties. This effectively made the Christian Church the largest single landholder in the Islamic Empire.
That is wild. I mean, you never hear about that.
Right, and the cultural synthesis among the elites was just as profound. Like in the early modern period, an educated, urban administrative official wouldn't even call themselves a Turk.
What do they call themselves?
They called themselves Rumi. They actually viewed the word Turk as a disparaging term reserved for rural, uneducated peasants in Anatolia.
Wait, Rumi, which literally translates to Roman.
Exactly, Roman.
So they are sitting in Constantinople, managing Roman tax systems, calling themselves Romans. I mean, they aren't erasing the legacy of Rome. They're actively claiming to be its continuation.
Yes. And once they secured that highly efficient integrated core, they projected power outward on a scale that terrified the rest of Europe.
This is the Golden Age stuff.
Right. Under Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, between 1520 and 1566, the empire expanded into Hungary, laid siege to Vienna, and captured Egypt.
Taking Egypt is a big deal, right?
A massive deal. It allowed the Ottoman sultans to claim the title of Caliph, the supreme leader of the global Muslim community.
That title fundamentally changes their geopolitical mandate. Like, they aren't just a regional power anymore. They are now the defenders of global Islam.
Precisely.
And that brings us back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, the alliances and the global wars. We're often taught about the Age of Discovery as this timeline where European ships, primarily from Spain and Portugal, just, sailed out and conquered the oceans unchecked.
Unchallenged.
Right. But the reality is that the Ottomans were fighting a multi-continental world war against the Iberian Union, so Spain and Portugal.
Yeah, this was a 16th century superpower stalemate. It wasn't just contained to the Mediterranean. The Portuguese were attempting to circumnavigate Africa to dominate the Indian Ocean spice trade.
Which directly threatened Ottoman economic monopolies, obviously.
Oh, massively. So the Ottomans fought them globally. When the Iberian forces tried to use the Philippines as a base to attack Muslim territories in Southeast Asia, the Ottomans didn't just sit back or send angry letters.
What did they do?
They actively deployed naval forces, cannons, and gunsmiths all the way across the Indian Ocean to Sumatra to militarily aid the Sultanate of Aceh against the Europeans.
That is insane. They're projecting hard military power into Southeast Asia in the 1500s.
Yeah, their reach was incredible.
And closer to home, they are orchestrating joint naval sieges with the French.
Because geopolitics completely trumped religious ideology. Both France and the Ottomans shared a mutual fear of Habsburg dominance. So, French King Francis I and Suleiman the Magnificent coordinated their militaries.
Just teamed up.
Yeah. During the 1540s and 50s, cities like Nice and Corsica were conquered by joint French-Ottoman fleets commanded by the legendary Ottoman Admiral Harridan Barbarossa. The Iberian-Ottoman conflict was two massive geopolitical blocs, perfectly matching each other in military technology, economic output, and sheer population.
Okay, so if they are matching the combined might of Spain and Portugal ship for ship and projecting power to Sumatra, we have to address a massive historical discrepancy.
The decline narrative.
Yeah. Why is the dominant narrative of the Ottoman Empire focused on this concept of the sick man of Europe? We are told that after Suleiman died in 1566, the empire just entered a 300-year, dusty, slow decline. How does that come from?
It comes from centuries of historians fundamentally misreading the 17th and 18th centuries. Older scholarship viewed anything that wasn't rapid territorial expansion as a decline.
So if you're not conquering, you're failing.
Right, which is flawed.
Right.
Modern scholars have entirely dismantled that stagnation thesis. The empire wasn't declining after 1566. It was entering a period of intense, highly successful adaptation.
Well, because the entire global economy was shifting underneath them, right? I mean, the Spanish were pulling massive amounts of silver out of the Americas, causing brutal global inflation. And new European ocean routes were actively bypassing the traditional Ottoman overland trade routes. They had to pivot or die.
And their pivot was brilliant. Let's look at global logistics. As the traditional overland spice routes lost their profitability to European oceanic shipping, the Ottomans recognized the rise of a highly lucrative new consumer commodity.
Which was?
Yemeni coffee.
No way. Coffee.
Yep. So instead of just watching their trade revenues vanish, they cornered a new market.
Wait, how do they actually monopolize something like that globally?
By heavily developing the infrastructure of Cairo, the Ottomans controlled the Red Sea ports where the coffee arrived from Yemen. They directed all that traffic through Egypt.
Oh, that makes sense.
Cairo was transformed into a massive global logistics hub for the coffee trade. They taxed it upon entry, processed it, and distributed it across the Mediterranean and Europe. The booming coffeehouse culture across the empire generated immense wealth.
So they were basically the 17th century equivalent of a global supply chain giant.
Yeah, that kept the region economically vibrant for centuries, completely countering the idea that their economy had stagnated.
And alongside that economic pivot, the political structure inside the palace was completely transforming too. This brings us to the Sultanate of Women, stretching from roughly 1533 to 1656.
This is a fascinating mechanical shift in Ottoman governance. For over a century, the imperial mothers and high-ranking consorts within the harem figures like Hurrem Sultan and Kozum Sultan exercised defining political power.
While the men did what?
Well, the sultans themselves increasingly stepped back from day-to-day governance. They resided deeper within the palace while a highly professionalized bureaucracy took over.
But how did these women legally or practically wield that power? I mean, it wasn't like they were holding public office or leading armies into battle.
They wielded it through extreme control of patronage networks and information flow. Because the sultan was cloistered, anyone who wanted access to him to secure a governorship, a military command, or a favorable tax ruling had to go through the harem.
Oh, so they were the gatekeepers.
More than just gatekeepers. These women placed their own loyalists in the position of Grand Vizier, essentially the prime minister, and actively dictated state policy, foreign diplomacy, and architectural projects. They were the administrative engine of the empire.
Wow. Okay, so let's look at the actual output of that engine. Imagine living in that system. You have an empire of 30 million people spanning 3 continents, practicing multiple religions and speaking dozens of languages.
A logistical nightmare.
Seriously. How do you govern that diversity without the state constantly tearing itself apart?
The mechanism they engineered is called the millet system. It is a highly specific form of religious pluralism.
How did it work?
In this framework, non-Muslim populations, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, the Jewish communities, were organized into their own legally recognized groups, or millets. As long as they paid the required taxes and did not rebel, the Ottoman state allowed them to govern their own internal affairs.
Like completely independently?
Pretty much. They operated their own religious courts, funded their own schools, and followed their own family laws.
It's almost like the Ottoman Sultan provided the central operating system.
Yeah.
He controlled the military and the macroeconomy, but he allowed the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Jews to run their own independent software programs for law and daily life on top of it.
That is a perfect analogy. It prevented the constant religious friction that was tearing Europe apart during the same period.
Which was a lot of friction.
Yeah, constant religious wars in Europe. However, we have to be careful not to romanticize the millet system through a modern lens. It was not equality.
Right.
Non-Muslims were protected, but they were legally subordinate. They paid higher taxes and faced specific restrictions, and that structural inequality is most visible in the most controversial mechanism of Ottoman statecraft.
The Devshirme system.
Yes.
Right. This is where the mechanics of the empire directly clash with modern morality. The Devshirme is essentially a human tax. State recruiters would go into the Christian villages, primarily in the Balkans, and just draft young boys away from their families.
Yep. They were converted to Islam, taken to the capital, and funneled into elite palace schools to be trained.
That sounds brutal. What was the logic behind that?
The logic behind it was entirely about centralizing power. If you hire existing aristocratic families to run your military, those families have their own inherited wealth, their own local loyalties, and their own agendas.
They become a threat to the throne.
Exactly. The Sultan wanted a class of elite administrators and soldiers whose absolute sole loyalty was to him. The boys taken through the Devshirme were educated in mathematics, administration, and warfare. They became the famous Janissary infantry, and the brightest among them became the Grand Viziers.
But this creates a bizarre historical paradox, doesn't it? On the one hand, this is state-sponsored slavery and forced conversion. It's an objectively brutal human tax.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, we read in the sources that some Muslim families actually tried to bribe recruiters to take their children, even though it was legally restricted to conquered Christians.
Because getting taken by the Devshirme was literally the only path for poor farm boy to eventually become the second most powerful man in the empire.
It is a profound contradiction.
It really is. It provided immense social mobility and created a hyper-competent, fiercely loyal bureaucracy that held the empire together for centuries. But, the trap of a perfect system is that it becomes rigid.
Ah, right. It stops adapting.
Exactly. By the 19th century, those elite janissaries and entrenched bureaucrats became highly reactionary. They actively resisted change just as the Industrial Revolution completely rewrote the rules of global power.
Which transitions us into the 19th century, the era of the Tanzimat reforms. The Ottomans realize they are rapidly falling behind European manufacturing and military tech, so they attempt to radically modernize.
Right, and they aren't just changing window dressing, they are trying to rebuild the entire state.
Yeah, they were systematically dismantling the old structures. They replaced religious law with secular legal codes. They attempted to transition centuries-old artisan guilds into modern, steam-powered factories to compete with European mass production.
And they were early adopters, too. They embraced new communication technologies almost instantly.
Like the telegraph.
Yes, Sultan Abdülmecid personally oversaw the testing of the telegraph with Samuel Morse himself in 1847.
That's incredible. Samuel Morse in Istanbul.
Right. They even modernized social laws, officially decriminalizing homosexuality in 1858.
Wait, 1858? That is remarkably early compared to much of the West.
It was. They were desperately trying to build a modern, centralized constitutional state. But the fatal flaw of rapid modernization is that it requires staggering amounts of capital.
Money they didn't have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To build railways, to equip modern armies, and particularly to fight off the aggressively expanding Russian Empire during conflicts like the Crimean War, the Ottoman state did something it had never done before.
It took on massive loans from European banks.
And those loans were structured with incredibly predatory interest rates. The empire simply could not generate enough industrial revenue to service the debt.
So what happened?
In 1875, the financial burden crushed them, and the Ottoman state was forced to formally declare bankruptcy. This led to a catastrophic loss of sovereignty. By 1881, the European creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration.
Okay, what does that actually look like on the ground? How does a foreign bank take over an empire?
It looks like an occupying financial army. The debt administration was an independent organization staffed by European officials sitting right in Istanbul. They bypassed the Sultan entirely and directly collected the revenues from the empire's most lucrative monopolies.
Wow.
Yeah, they physically collected the taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, and alcohol. They drained the wealth of the empire straight into the vaults of London and Paris.
So the empire is completely hollowed out from the inside. I mean, they've lost their economic sovereignty. And while the banks are draining the treasury, the physical borders of the empire are actively collapsing, triggering one of the largest, least discussed demographic crises in modern history.
Yes. As the empire lost vast territories in the Balkans, the Crimea, and the Caucasus to rising Christian nation-states and the Russian Empire, the Muslim populations living in those areas faced horrific persecution and ethnic cleansing.
And where did they go?
Between 1850 and World War I, an estimated 7 to 9 million Muslim refugees, Circassians, Crimean Tatars, Balkan Muslims fled for their lives, pouring into the steadily shrinking borders of Anatolia.
You have a bankrupt state, physical borders collapsing, and millions of traumatized, destitute refugees flooding into the core. That pressure cooker directly fuels the tragic final act. It sets the stage for the Young Turk Revolution in 1908.
It does.
What starts as a push for a constitutional democracy rapidly devolves, under the pressure of constant territorial loss, into a radical ethno-nationalist dictatorship.
And it is that radicalized Young Turk government that makes the fatal decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany, hoping to win back lost territory.
The ultimate gamble.
And they lose. The global war finally tears the remaining fabric of the empire to shreds. You see massive internal dissent, most notably the Arab Revolt. And under the cover of the war, the state turns on its own people.
Right. And as the source material objectively states, the Young Turk leadership orchestrated systematic atrocities, engaging in horrific genocides against its minority populations, including Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, resulting in the deaths of over 1 million people.
It is the absolute collapse of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious mosaic that the millet system had managed for centuries.
Replaced by the lethal logic of ethno-nationalism.
Exactly. Following the defeat in World War I, the victorious Allies partitioned the empire, carving up the Middle East. But out of the ashes of Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk emerges.
He leads the Turkish War of Independence, expels the occupying Allied forces, and in 1922 officially abolishes the 600-year-old Sultanate.
Yes. But Ataturk's mission wasn't just to change the borders. If we connect this to the bigger picture, he recognized that to build a modern, secular Republic of Turkey, he had to aggressively dismantle the entire Ottoman cultural framework.
How so?
In 1924, he abolished the caliphate, ending the global religious authority the sultans had held for 400 years. He shut down the religious courts. He completely overhauled the education system.
And most strikingly, the language itself, right?
Yes. He replaced the Arabic-based script, which had been used to write Ottoman Turkish for centuries, with a new Latin-based alphabet.
That is a profound cultural severing. I mean, if you woke up a decade later, you literally could not read the archives of your own state or, the gravestone of your grandfather.
It was an intentional, definitive break from the past. The sublime Ottoman state, which was the official, formal name of the empire, was dismantled down to its very linguistic roots.
It is a breathtakingly sudden end to a state that fundamentally architected the modern world. I think the core takeaway here is that we have to retire the myth of the sick man.
Long overdue.
The Ottomans were not a 300-year waiting room for World War I. They were a dynamic, terrifyingly efficient superpower that synthesized Roman taxation, Islamic governance, and global trade into a resilient, formidable machine.
They absolutely were. And if we pull all of these mechanics together, it leaves you with one critical final thought to consider.
What's that?
For 6 centuries, the sublime Ottoman state acted as a massive stabilizing umbrella over the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa. Through systems like the millet, they managed incredibly deep sectarian, religious, and ethnic divides. Today, look at a map of those exact regions. Look at the daily headlines. How many of our modern geopolitical crises, our fractured borders, and our intractable conflicts are simply the world still trying to figure out how to organize itself in the absence of the Ottoman Empire?
Wow. That is a haunting perspective to leave on. We started by looking for the history of a fallen empire, but perhaps what we actually found is that the ghost of the Ottomans is still the underlying anatomy of the modern world. So if you ask most people to visualize their organs, wait, I shouldn't say it like that. You ask them to just picture what's inside them.
Well, they tend to assign them these very rigid, singular identities, like cartoon versions of organs.
Exactly. Like the stomach is just a chemical vat, and the heart is, a mechanical pump.
Right.
And the lungs, well, we usually just relegate them to the role of basically passive biological meat balloons.
Meat balloons, that's incredibly accurate to how we think of them.
Right. You inhale, they expand. You exhale, they deflate. It is a very comfortable, straightforward visual.
It is, but it's also, frankly, a massive disservice to what is objectively one of the most dynamic, heavily trafficked intersections in human biology.
Yeah.
Because treating the lungs merely as, air sacs, it completely ignores about 90% of their actual job description.
Which is exactly why we are tearing up that textbook definition today. So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive into your own chest cavity.
We've gathered a really comprehensive stack of source material dissecting the modern understanding of the human lung.
And our mission today is to completely reshape your relationship with every single breath you take. We are moving past the simple mechanics of inflation.
Yeah, we're looking at the hidden reality here. The fact that your lungs operate as covert chemical factories, vital blood reservoirs, and just absolute evolutionary marvels.
To do that, we are going to travel from the gross structural anatomy of the rib cage down into the microscopic border crossings of single-cell walls.
And then eventually we'll zoom back out into the bizarre evolutionary pathways of, spiders and crocodiles.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get down to the microscopic machinery, let's establish the physical real estate these organs actually command.
Right.
Ground us in the macro architecture inside the human chest.
Sure. So the first thing to understand is that your lungs absolutely dominate your thoracic cavity, but they are not identical twins. No, they are distinctly asymmetrical to accommodate the rest of the neighborhood. Your right lung is actually the larger and heavier of the two, and it's divided by fissures into 3 distinct lobes.
But the left side has a space constraint because of the heart, right?
Exactly.
So how does the left lung adapt to that structurally? Does it just squish out of the way?
It quite literally yields the space, yeah. The left lung only has 2 lobes, and along its inner border, it features a physical indentation.
Like a dent.
Yeah, it's known as the cardiac notch. It essentially acts as a protective cradle for the heart.
Oh, wow.
And to structurally compensate for that missing third lobe, the left lung actually has a small, sort of tongue-like projection at its base. It's called the lingula.
The lingula. So they are totally custom fitted around the cardiovascular system.
They really are.
How much mass are we talking about for the whole package? Like, if you weighed them.
Together, they weigh around 1.3 kilograms.
So just shy of 3 pounds.
Right. But the mass is deceiving, you know. Because they are incredibly porous, within that 1.3 kilograms, you have an estimated 2,400 kilometers of branching airways.
Wait, 2,400 kilometers? That is like roughly 1,500 miles of tubing folded up behind my ribs.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
It's like taking the distance from New York to Miami
Yeah.
and aggressively folding it into a space the size of a shoebox.
The geometry required to make that fit is staggering.
Mm.
And at the terminal end of all those microscopic branching tubes are the alveoli.
Those are the tiny air sacs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where oxygen actually enters your blood. You have somewhere between 300 and 500 million of them.
Which brings up a statistic I feel like everyone has heard at some point.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
The classic claim that if you spread your lungs out flat, they would cover an entire tennis court. Given the numbers you just dropped, does that actually hold up?
No, it's actually a deeply entrenched myth.
Wait, really?
Yeah, completely. I mean, the surface area of the lungs is immense, don't get me wrong. It's estimated to be between 50 and 75 square meters.
Okay.
But a standard singles tennis court is significantly larger than that. It's closer to 195 square meters. Oh, wow.
So in reality, the surface area of your lungs is less than half of a tennis court.
Consider that myth busted. But honestly, 50 to 75 square meters of delicate tissue folded inside my chest is still a biological miracle.
Oh, absolutely.
It's essentially microscopic origami. But if we follow the logic of that massive surface area,
Yeah.
every time you take a breath, you are exposing 50 square meters of highly sensitive wet tissue to whatever is in the atmosphere.
Right.
How does an area that large not become immediately clogged with atmospheric dust, pollen, and bacteria?
Well, it survives because it operates an aggressive, fully automated self-cleaning mechanism.
Okay.
Because the sheer volume of incoming debris means your lungs can't just filter the air. They have to physically transport the garbage out.
Right, like an active disposal system.
Exactly. And this relies on a process called mucociliary clearance.
Mucociliary clearance.
Yeah.
So that implies mucus and cilia. How do they coordinate?
Think of the lining of your upper airways as a microscopic, upward-moving conveyor belt.
Okay, I'm picturing it. The foundational layer consists of goblet cells. They're aptly named because they look like little chalices, and they continuously secrete mucus.
And that mucus acts as, what, a trap?
Yes, a highly effective sticky trap. It catches pathogens and particulate matter the very moment they land.
But I mean, a sticky trap is totally useless if you just leave it there to rot. The dirt needs an exit strategy.
Exactly, and that is where the ciliated cells step in. Interspersed among all those goblet cells are cells featuring hundreds of tiny hair-like projections, the cilia.
Right, the hairs.
And they don't just wave around randomly, they beat in a highly coordinated, rhythmic, upward stroke.
Upward against gravity.
Yes, they literally sweep the contaminated mucus up your respiratory tract toward your pharynx.
And then what happens?
Well, you either swallow it harmlessly into your stomach acid, which destroys the bacteria, or you cough it out.
Wow, a self-cleaning escalator. That makes perfect sense for the tubes. But what happens when we get down to the alveoli? Those 500 million air sacs? You can't have mucus down there, or you wouldn't be able to absorb oxygen through it, would you?
You've hit on the central engineering paradox of the lung right there. The alveoli must remain pristine and dry enough for gas to pass through.
So the escalator stops.
The escalator system stops entirely before it reaches them. The alveolar walls themselves are incredibly thin.
How thin?
Super thin. 95% of that surface area is made up of type I cells, which are flattened squamous cells. They basically act as ultra-thin glass windows to allow oxygen to slide directly into your bloodstream.
Okay, so if type I cells take up 95% of the space, what is happening in the remaining 5%?
That 5% is occupied by type 2 cells, and honestly, they are arguably the unsung heroes of your chest.
Really? Why?
Well, they're cube-shaped, and they typically cluster in the corners of the alveolar. Their primary function is to secrete a substance called lung surfactant.
Surfactant, what does that do?
Without surfactant, the natural surface tension of the microscopic layer of water in your lungs would act like a wet plastic bag.
Oh, meaning it would just stick to itself.
Exactly. The moment you exhaled, the walls of the alveoli would stick together and collapse permanently.
So they are constantly producing a biological anti-stick coating?
They are. But their secondary function is even more remarkable.
Tell me.
Because type I cells are so incredibly thin and specialized, they've actually lost the ability to divide and reproduce.
Wait, so they can't repair themselves?
No, they can't. If a type I cell is damaged, a type 2 cell will literally differentiate it shapeshifts into a type I cell to patch the hole in the wall.
Are you kidding? So they act as an embedded stem cell repair crew, just fixing the windows on the fly.
Pretty much. But that still doesn't solve the debris problem you mentioned earlier.
Right, because if there's no mucus escalator down there and a stray piece of dust bypasses the upper airways, what removes it?
The immune system dispatches a specialized cleanup crew called alveolar macrophages.
Macrophages.
Yeah, you can visualize them as independent sweepers or like little Pac-Men patrolling the air sacs.
Raw.
If they encounter a stray bacterium, a piece of dust, or even a red blood cell that accidentally leaked from a capillary, the macrophage just envelops and digests it.
Looks amazing.
Add to that a protein called elastin, which gives the alveolar walls their rubber band-like recoil, and these tiny interconnecting escape hatches between the sacs called the pores of Kohn, and you have a highly resilient, dynamic microenvironment.
Resilient, yes, but obviously not invincible.
No, definitely not.
Because if we look at the lifestyle choices people make, we're introducing some severe chemical stressors to this micro world every day.
Very true.
Mechanically speaking, how does something like, say, chronic alcohol consumption compromise that system?
Well, alcohol essentially paralyzes your defense mechanism.
It paralyzes them.
Chronic exposure to alcohol actively desensitizes the cilia. It alters the way the proteins function inside those hair-like structures, which physically slows down the upward beating of the escalator.
Oh, wow. So the escalator just grinds to a halt.
Exactly. And when the mucus stagnates, bacteria are allowed to sit and multiply inside the warm, wet environment of the lungs.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. That stagnation is the direct mechanism behind why chronic alcohol use drastically increases the risk of severe pneumonia.
The escalator breaks down, and the garbage piles up. But what about smoking?
Ah, smoking.
If the lungs are so adaptable, with these shape-shifting cells and macrophage Pac-Man, why is cigarette smoke able to cause such permanent structural devastation?
Because smoking doesn't just overwhelm the filters. It actively hacks the immune response and turns your own enzymes against you.
Turns them against you.
Yeah. The chemical stress of the smoke deranges the basal cells, preventing normal repair. But critically, it triggers widespread inflammation.
Okay.
Your immune cells flood the area and release an enzyme called elastase.
Let me guess. Elastase is designed to break down elastin.
Correct. And remember, elastin is what keeps your alveoli tight and bouncy. When elastase floods the tissue, it literally digests the structural framework of your lungs.
Oh my God.
The walls separating those 500 million tiny bubbles just dissolved. They fuse together into these large, floppy, inefficient, empty cavities that cannot push air back out.
So you lose the surface area and the elasticity simultaneously.
Yes, and that structural collapse is the fundamental definition of emphysema.
That is just a terrifying chain reaction. You are basically provoking your immune system into eating your own structural framework.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because in the source material, there's a fundamental shift in how we categorize the lung.
Yes, there is.
We have to look at the exact border where the air stops and the blood begins.
Yeah.
Because it turns out the lung is running a massive secondary operation that has absolutely nothing to do with breathing.
It is, and it fundamentally changes how we view the organ. Your lungs are so deeply entangled with your cardiovascular system that they function as a highly active metabolic and endocrine hub. To start with, your lungs require a unique dual blood supply.
Wait, why do they need two separate blood supplies?
Well, you have the pulmonary circulation, which is the massive volume of deoxygenated blood arriving from the right side of your heart.
That's the blood that needs oxygen.
Exactly. The lungs' job is to process that blood, fill it with oxygen, and send it back. But the physical tissue of the lung itself, the bronchi, the supporting structures, they can't survive on that deoxygenated blood.
Oh, of course. They need oxygen too.
Right. So the body routes a completely separate system, the bronchial circulation, directly from the aorta. It delivers freshly oxygenated blood to feed the lung tissue itself.
It's like a massive industrial processing plant getting its own private catering line so the workers don't starve while they process the main product.
That is an excellent analogy, but, their relationship with the blood goes well beyond just processing and consuming.
How so?
The lungs actually act as a strategic blood reservoir for the entire body.
A reservoir.
Yes. At any given moment, approximately 450 milliliters of blood, nearly 9% of your total blood volume, is just pooling in the highly compliant vessels of your chest.
Wait, why hoard 9% of the blood supply? If I'm running or exercising, wouldn't I want that circulating?
You hoard it for emergencies. The pulmonary vessels are incredibly flexible. If you suffer a severe hemorrhage, like a trauma where your systemic blood pressure drops dangerously low, your pulmonary blood vessels will automatically constrict. This action forcibly shifts that stored 450 milliliters out of the lungs and straight into your systemic circulation.
Wow.
It is an automated biological failsafe to keep your brain and vital organs perfused with blood when you're bleeding out.
So they are quite literally a physiological blood bank. That alone changes my perspective completely.
Yeah, no, right?
But the source material also mentions blood pressure regulation. How does an air sac control blood pressure?
Through chemical synthesis. The endothelial cells lining the blood vessels within your lungs actually manufacture an enzyme called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme.
ACE, right? I've heard of ACE inhibitors for blood pressure.
Exactly. This plays a pivotal role in the renin-angiotensin system. When your body detects that your blood pressure is too low, it releases a mild precursor called angiotensin I.
Okay.
As that blood flows through your lungs, ACE instantly converts it into angiotensin II, which is a potent vasoconstrictor.
Meaning it tightens the blood vessels?
Yes. It causes your blood vessels to clamp down, driving your blood pressure back up to safe levels.
So the lungs are manufacturing the chemical wrench that tightens the plumbing.
Exactly. And the systemic influence doesn't stop there either.
What else is there?
Well, recent studies confirm that the lungs are a major site of platelet production.
Platelets. Like for blood clotting.
Yeah. Megakaryocytes, these giant cells that create blood platelets, actually migrate from the bone marrow to the lungs. And the physical environment of the pulmonary capillary bed literally helps shear them apart to release platelets into your blood.
So we've got a platelet factory, a blood bank, and a blood pressure regulator.
All hidden in your chest. And we haven't even touched on the nervous system interface yet.
There's a nervous system interface?
Oh, yeah. Scattered throughout the lining of your airways are pulmonary neuroendocrine cells.
Okay, what do they do?
These specialized cells extend tiny sensors into the airway lumen to monitor the chemical composition of the air you inhale.
Like tasting the air.
Literally. If they detect dropping oxygen levels or certain irritants, they don't just signal the brain. They actively produce and secrete neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine directly into the surrounding tissue.
Wait, they are dosing the body with serotonin based on the air quality. Why would they do that?
Because serotonin acts locally to constrict or dilate the pulmonary blood vessels and the airway smooth muscle.
Oh, I see.
It's a way for the lung to internally optimize where the blood and air are flowing, matching the perfusion of blood to the specific areas getting the best ventilation. Your lungs are actively tasting the air and adjusting your internal plumbing in real time.
That shatters the meat balloon visual entirely. It is a highly sensitive, autonomous manufacturing plant.
It really is.
But, seeing how unbelievably complex and specialized the human lung is, it begs the question of evolution.
Yeah, how did we get here?
Exactly. How did nature arrive at this specific solution? Did other branches of the animal kingdom solve the breathing problem differently?
They absolutely did. And the evolutionary history of the lung is full of just wild divergences.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, the most common misconception is that human lungs evolved from fish gills. Like a fish crawled onto land and its gills simply internalized.
Right, that's definitely what I pictured.
It's entirely false. Gills and lungs are completely separate evolutionary tracks.
If not from gills, where did the blueprints for lungs come from?
Vertebrate lungs are actually homologous to the gas bladders of fish.
Gas bladders.
Yeah. Millions of years ago, certain ancient bony fish living in stagnant, oxygen-poor water developed simple outpocketings of their esophagus.
Just little pouches.
Right. When the water couldn't provide enough oxygen, they would swim to the surface and gulp atmospheric air into these simple sacs to survive.
Wow.
Over millions of years, those tiny digestive pouches evolved into the complex respiratory systems of land-dwelling tetrapods.
So we are essentially breathing through highly modified fish swim bladders.
In terms of their evolutionary origin, yes. But the mechanics of how animals inflate those bladders vary wildly across the animal kingdom. Take birds, for instance.
How do birds breathe?
Well, humans use a bellows system. Air goes in, stops, and goes back out the exact same way. It is inherently inefficient because the old air mixes with the new air.
Right, dead space.
Exactly. Birds, however, require massive amounts of oxygen to sustain flight, so they evolved circulatory lungs.
Circulatory. How do you circulate air without breathing it back out the same way?
It relies on an intricate supply chain of air sacs extending deep into their abdomen and even into their hollow bones.
Into their bones. That's wild.
Yeah. When a bird inhales, the fresh air bypasses the lungs and fills the posterior air sacs. When they exhale, that fresh air is pushed forward into the lungs across tiny parallel tubes called parabronchi.
Okay, I'm following.
Then the next inhale pushes that air into anterior sacs, and the next exhale pushes it out of the body. The mechanical result is continuous unidirectional airflow.
That's incredible.
The lungs are bathed in fresh oxygen on both the inhale and the exhale.
It's like replacing a hand bellows with a continuous jet engine.
Yeah.
It is brilliant. What about reptiles? They don't have the metabolic demands of flight, but their anatomy presents some unique challenges.
Reptiles provide some of the most fascinating biomechanical workarounds. Consider a turtle.
Okay.
Its ribs are permanently fused to its shell. They literally cannot expand their chest to draw a breath.
Oh, I never thought of that. How do they breathe?
To circumvent this, turtles utilize the muscles of their forelimbs and their pectoral girdle to physically compress and expand their lungs.
Wait, they are pumping their arms to push the air out?
Yes, exactly.
That is incredibly resourceful. And I read in the source material about crocodiles using something called a hepatic piston.
Yes, the hepatic piston.
Please explain the physics of a hepatic piston to me, because it sounds crazy.
It is as aggressive as it sounds. So crocodilians possess a muscle anchored to their pelvic bone that extends all the way up to attach to their massive liver.
To their liver?
Yes. When a crocodile wants to inhale, it contracts that muscle, violently yanking the liver backward toward its tail.
No way. They are literally using their liver as an internal plunger.
Exactly. Pulling the massive organ backward drastically increases the volume of the chest cavity, which creates a vacuum that pulls air in.
Wow.
Conversely, amphibians like frogs don't use vacuums at all. They rely on positive pressure through a mechanism called buccal pumping.
Buccal pumping.
Yeah, a frog lowers the floor of its mouth to suck air in, closes its nostrils, and physically swallows the air, using its throat muscles to forcefully shove the air down into its lungs.
Literally swallowing air like food.
Yep.
And if we look outside of vertebrates entirely to invertebrates, I know bugs don't have a chest cavity or a diaphragm.
Right. Invertebrates arrived at entirely different respiratory solutions through convergent evolution. Many arachnids, like spiders and scorpions, utilize book lungs.
Book lungs.
These are delicate stacks of alternating air pockets and tissue filled with hemolymph, which is the equivalent of spider blood. They are arranged exactly like the folded pages of a book, maximizing surface area for gas diffusion straight from the atmosphere.
Nature really just reinvents the wheel over and over.
Oh, for sure. And perhaps the most bizarre example is the giant terrestrial coconut crab.
The ones that look like heavily armored trash cans.
Yes, those. They employ bronchostal lungs. Coconut crabs begin their life cycle in the ocean as larvae, breathing underwater. But as they mature and move onto land, they develop these terrestrial lungs. Their gills atrophy to the point of being vestigial. The transformation is so complete that if you submerge an adult coconut crab in the ocean, it will drown.
Wait, a crab that drowns?
It is a crab that has completely lost the ability to breathe water.
An ocean creature that will drown in the ocean. It is amazing how highly specialized respiration can become. So, to bring it back to you, the listener, how does our human system compare?
Good question.
If we aren't swallowing air like frogs, and we certainly aren't using our livers as plungers, what is the exact physics of a human breath?
Human breathing is dictated by Boyle's law, which states that in a closed system, pressure and volume are inversely proportional.
Okay, Physics 101.
Right. Beneath your lungs sits the diaphragm, a massive dome-shaped sheet of muscle. When you decide to inhale, your diaphragm flexes, pulling downward and flattening out.
And your ribs move too, right?
Yes. Simultaneously, your intercostal muscles pull your ribcage up and out. This instantly expands the physical volume of your thoracic cavity.
And according to Boyle's law, expanding the volume drops the pressure.
Precisely. The pressure inside your chest drops below the atmospheric pressure surrounding your body. You don't actually pull the air in, you create an internal vacuum. And the weight of the Earth's atmosphere physically rushes in to equalize the pressure.
You create the void, and the atmosphere fills it.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking to dismantle the idea of the passive meat balloon.
And I think we did.
Definitely. We busted the tennis court myth, scaling it back to 50 square meters of highly protected microscopic origami. We explored the mechanics of shape-shifting type 2 cells and macrophage Pac-Men defending the walls.
Yeah.
We uncovered a secondary life where the lungs function as an emergency blood bank, a platelet factory, and a chemical regulatory system sensing oxygen and dosing serotonin.
Right.
And we looked across the animal kingdom at birds with continuous jet engine lungs, crocodiles using their livers as plungers, and spiders breathing through biological books. It is a staggering network of complexity hidden right behind your ribs.
It truly is. And yet, for all that complexity, I think the most profound piece of the source material is the sheer vulnerability of how that system begins.
What do you mean?
Well, because right now, for anyone listening, your lungs feel like a permanent fixed engine. You breathe in, you breathe out, it's automatic. But before you were born, they were completely dormant.
Right, because a fetus doesn't breathe air.
They don't. Before birth, your lungs were entirely filled with fetal lung fluid, and they were wildly underdeveloped. You possessed only about 1/6 of the alveoli that you have right now.
So you barely had any of the air sac.
Exactly. Your mother's blood provided all your oxygen while your lungs simply waited.
So you are floating in fluid, with lungs that aren't even fully built yet.
Yeah.
How do you make the transition from a water-dwelling organism to an air-breathing one without suffocating?
It is triggered by a shock to the system.
Mm.
The moment you are born, the sudden jarring drop in temperature from the womb to the delivery room hits your skin.
Just the cold air.
The cold air. That thermal shock sends a massive alarm signal to your central nervous system. Your brain panics and forces your diaphragm to violently contract for the very first time. You take a desperate gasp.
Wow.
In roughly 10 seconds, the pressure dynamics in your lungs radically shift. The fetal fluid is rapidly absorbed into the surrounding tissue or exhaled.
In 10 seconds.
Just 10 seconds. The blood vessels in the lungs dilate, blood rushes in to meet the air, and the lifelong rhythm of gas exchange officially begins.
A 10-second window to completely change how you survive in the world.
And the most incredible part is that because you only had a fraction of your alveoli at that moment, you physically grew the vast majority of your lung capacity after you were already born.
That's insane.
You built the microscopic origami while you were actively using it to stay alive.
Think about that. The next time you find yourself dizzy from standing up too fast or catching your breath after a run, remember that you are not just inflating a pair of balloons. You are operating a custom-built, shape-shifting chemical refinery that you spent your entire childhood growing. And it all started with a single shocked gasp in a cold room. Take a deep breath, appreciate the machinery, and we'll see you on the next deep dive. Imagine for a second, right, a creature so fundamentally terrifying that an entire thriving civilization of dwarves simply packs up and abandons their ancient underground metropolis.
It's just gone.
Yeah, they don't just lose a skirmish and fall back to regroup. They literally leave their ancestral home, like their greatest architectural achievement, completely empty forever.
Right.
And if that isn't enough to set the stakes for you, imagine a powerful wizard, a being, who has spent centuries facing down dark magic and ancient evils across the continent, looking at this exact same creature and flatly admitting this is a foe beyond any of you.
I mean, it's the ultimate fantasy mic drop.
Right.
You know, immediately that whatever is stepping out of those shadows isn't just like a standard dungeon monster. It is a walking extinction level event.
It really is.
Yeah.
And today, we are taking a deep dive into a massive stack of lore notes, obscure linguistic histories, and, well, authorial drafts to figure out what a Balrog actually is. Because for you, the listener, truly understanding this creature means looking at how J.R.R. Tolkien fundamentally rewrote his own universe to make them scarier.
Yeah, and the bizarre ancient words he dug up to design them.
Exactly. Yeah. And, how this one shadow demon completely conquered modern pop culture. So, okay, let's unpack this, because I've got a stack of sources here that completely contradict each other.
Yeah, they do.
Like in one early text, I'm reading about an army of 1,000 Balrogs literally riding into battle on the backs of dragons.
Right.
But then in the final lore, they are described as these ultra-rare, immortal, angelic beings. So how do we reconcile this? Did the author just completely change his mind?
Well, that contradiction is actually the key to understanding how meticulous this world building really is. Because if you only know Balrogs from passing pop culture references, you probably think they are just generic underworld demons.
Yes, just big fire guys.
Yeah, right. But Tolkien's final settled lore states that Balrogs are actually Maiar. And to put that into perspective, the Maiar are a class of angelic, primordial spirits who existed in the void before the physical creation of the universe itself.
Wait, hold on. Gandalf is a Maya?
Yep.
And the Dark Lord Sauron is a Maya. You're telling me this giant beast wielding a flaming whip is the exact same species as the wizard fighting it?
They are of the exact same order, yeah. The hierarchy in this universe places the Valar at the absolute top. Think of them as like archangels or lesser gods.
Okay.
And the Maiar are the tier right beneath them. So the Balrogs were specifically Maiar associated with fire, but before the world was even fully formed, they were corrupted by the most powerful, evil Vala, a being named Melkor, who was later known as Morgoth.
Wow.
Yeah, and in their final conceptual iteration, Tolkien defined them as immortal spirits of fire, darkness, and shadow, wielding fiery whips of many thongs, long swords, black axes, and maces.
But that goes back to the contradiction in my notes. Because in the early drafts, like the Quintus Silmarillion, they were everywhere. It says Morgoth had a host of 1,000 of them.
Right.
Like in the early versions of the storming of the elven city of Gondolin, you have hundreds of Balrogs acting as basically elite shock troops.
Yeah, in those early writings from the 1910s and 20s, they were roughly twice human size. And while they were fierce, they were significantly more destructible.
Like they could die.
Exactly. Elven warriors could, and occasionally did, kill them in conventional battle. They were heavily armed with steel claws and iron mail, but they were essentially just high-level infantry.
It feels incredibly similar to modern video game design, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
It's like Tolkien looked at his own universe, realized he had made his scariest monsters way too common, and decided to issue a massive patch to the lore.
A lore patch. I love that.
Yeah. He gave them like the ultimate nerf and buff. He completely nerfed their population numbers to make them incredibly rare, but he massively buffed their power stats, turning them from standard enemy grunts into ultra-rare, unbeatable boss monsters.
And that patch is literally documented in the margins of his work.
Really?
Yeah, Christopher Tolkien, who famously edited and compiled his father's posthumous works, pointed out a very late marginal note from his father, one that didn't make it into the main published text, actually.
What did it say?
It explicitly stated that at most 7 Balrogs ever existed in the entire history of the world.
7, down from 1,000.
Yep.
But dropping their numbers and upgrading them to primordial angelic spirits raises a massive logical problem for me.
Which is?
Well, if they are immortal spirits who existed before the physical universe, how do you actually kill one?
Right.
The text says only their physical form can be destroyed. What does that actually mean in practice?
So this touches on one of the most fascinating mechanics of divine beings in Middle-earth. Tolkien explains that the Valar and Maiar can naturally change their shape at will. They can move, as he phrases it, unclad in the raiment of the world.
Unclad in the raiment of the world. That's so poetic.
It really is. That basically means they can exist invisibly as pure, formless consciousness without needing a physical body at all.
Okay.
But, and this is the crucial catch, when an angelic spirit aligns itself with evil, and specifically when it exerts its innate power to dominate and control the physical material of the world, it pours its essence into that physical form.
Oh, I see. So by trying to physically dominate the world, they essentially trap themselves inside it. They're like pouring wet concrete that eventually hardens around them, and suddenly they lose their shape-shifting privileges.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The corruption locks them in. We see this with their master Morgoth, who eventually became permanently stuck in the form of a dark tyrant and couldn't even heal the burns he got from holding holy jewels. Or the wounds he took in battle. Right?
Exactly. And Sauron lost his ability to assume a fair, pleasing form after his physical body was destroyed in the cataclysmic flood. So, while Tolkien doesn't explicitly spell out the biological mechanics for Balrogs, the absolute implication is that their corruption locked them into these terrifying bodies of soot and magma.
Wow.
You can destroy that physical body, sure, but doing so requires an equal primordial power, like the power of another Maya.
Like Gandalf.
But Gandalf, yeah.
Which perfectly explains why the two named Balrogs in the lore caused such catastrophic, world-altering damage. Since there were only ever a maximum of 7, the ones we actually meet are devastating.
Let's look at the VIPs of the underworld, starting with the big boss.
Gothmog.
Oh, Gothmog. I mean, his resume is essentially a chronological list of the greatest tragedies of the First Age.
Yeah, the brutal.
He holds the titles of Lord of the Balrogs, High Captain of Angband, and Marshal of the Hosts. He wields a massive black axe. And he wasn't just a battlefield commander, he was an era-ending threat to the elves.
He is the one who mortally wounds Fëanor, the brilliant elf who forged the Silmarils and basically kickstarted the entire mythology of this universe. He slays Fingon, the High King. He captures the greatest human warrior to ever live, Huron.
It would be like a single enemy general taking out Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus in one war.
Literally, yes.
He is systematically wiping out the greatest heroes of an entire age. And his origin story in the early lore is completely unhinged.
It is wild.
In the Book of Lost Tales, his original name was Kasamot, and he was literally the son of Morgoth and an ogress named Ulbandi.
Yeah, Tolkien eventually moved completely away from the idea of angelic beings biologically reproducing. He felt it didn't fit the grander mythic tone he was developing.
Makes sense.
But that early draft shows you just how central Gothmog was to the hierarchy of evil. He was second only to the Dark Lord himself.
But he does die eventually.
He does. His end finally comes during the tragic, fiery fall of the hidden city of Gondolin. He engages in a brutal, single combat with the elf lord Ecthelion of the Fountain, and they end up mutually killing each other, drowning in the king's deep fountain.
So Gothmog shows us what a Balrog does when it's an active military commander in a global war.
Right.
But what happens to a weapon of mass destruction when the war is over? The creator is defeated, and it has no one left to command it.
It just waits.
Which brings us to the second name, Balrog, the one everybody knows.
Yeah.
Durin's Bane, the Terror of Moria. But I have to push back on this creature's timeline for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
The text says it survived the ancient defeat of Morgoth, crawled under the Misty Mountains, and then just slept. For 5,000 years.
Basically, yeah.
Like, you're telling me this primordial weapon of mass destruction was just taking a 5 millennia snooze, and it only woke up because the dwarves were practically drilling into its ceiling for shiny metal.
Well, yeah, it sounds absurd out of context, I grant you that. But avarice is the thematic driver here. This dormant weapon of mass destruction was buried at the very roots of the mountain Caradhras. Above it, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm built their greatest kingdom. And they were mining for mithril, right? A fantastical metal that was lighter than silk, but harder than steel, and infinitely more valuable than gold.
So they just kept digging.
Exactly. Their greed for this metal drove them to dig too deeply and too greedily, completely ignoring the warning signs of what lay beneath.
And the devastation it unleashes when it wakes up is absolute. It slaughters the dwarf king Durin the Sixth, which is how it gets the nickname Durin's Bane. And within a year, it kills his successor, too.
She massacre.
The dwarves are completely driven out of their own ancestral home. The kingdom is renamed Moria, which translates to the Black Pit. The aura of terror it emits is so profound that even the Sylvan elves living in the neighboring forest flee from what they can only describe as the nameless terror.
Yeah, they don't even know what it is.
Even centuries later, after the dwarves win a massive, bloody battle right outside the gates of Moria, their leader, Dane, looks inside the open doors, feels the sheer, suffocating terror of the Balrog waiting in the dark, and turns to his people and simply says, "Do not go in there."
The presence of this single entity creates a permanent continental no-go zone.
Seriously.
And that sets the stage for the Fellowship of the Ring. When they are forced to travel through the pitch-black mines of Moria, they awaken it again. And this is where we actually get to see the magical mechanics of the Balrog on full display, rather than just its physical strength.
Yes. Oh, the scene in the Chamber of Mazarbul is phenomenal. Gandalf tries to put a magical shutting spell on a stone door to block their pursuers.
Right.
But the Balrog approaches from the other side completely unseen and casts a counterspell. The magic is so terrible and ancient that it almost breaks Gandalf's mind.
It's a mental battle.
Yeah, the wizard is forced to speak a word of command to hold the door, and the sheer magical pressure causes the physical door to shatter, collapsing the entire room. It's a terrifying battle of angelic wills before they even make eye contact.
Which culminates in the famous confrontation on the narrow bridge of Khazad-dûm.
Of course.
The elf Legolas instantly recognizes the despair of what is approaching. Gandalf stands his ground, identifying the Balrog's primordial origins by calling it the Flame of Udun, referencing Morgoth's ancient ruined fortress.
So cool.
And Gandalf shatters the bridge, the Balrog falls into the abyss, but in its final moment, its fiery whip catches Gandalf's knees, dragging the wizard down with it.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because they don't just fall to their death.
Yeah, they don't.
They crash into a deep, freezing subterranean lake at the very roots of the world. And the text notes that the freezing water extinguishes the Balrog's flames, turning it into a thing of slime, stronger than a strangling snake.
Yeah.
It's such a bizarre, horrifying biological pivot. It's no longer a majestic creature of fire. It's this primordial, slimy, suffocating force of pure muscle in the dark.
The water literally strips away the terrifying majesty of the fire demon and reduces it to pure, desperate malice.
Wow.
They fight blindly in the freezing water, the Balrog trying to strangle Gandalf, until the monster flees into the uncharted, ancient tunnels gnawed by nameless things deep in the earth. And what follows is an unimaginable marathon of endurance.
The chase.
Yeah, Gandalf pursues the Balrog for 8 relentless days, climbing from the roots of the earth all the way up the endless stair to the freezing mountain peak of Xeraxagil.
Where it bursts back into flames the second it hits the open air. And they fight for 2 straight days and nights until Gandalf finally casts it down, and the impact of the demon's body literally shatters the mountainside.
Just unbelievable scale.
And Gandalf dies from the sheer exhaustion of the battle, though he is famously sent back.
Right. The sheer scale of that encounter is breathtaking. But to truly understand where a sequence like that comes from, we have to transition from the peak of a fantasy mountain to a dusty desk in Oxford.
Okay, let's go.
Because Tolkien wasn't just a fantasy author daydreaming about monsters. He was a professional philologist, a scholar of historical linguistics and ancient languages.
I love this part because it's like he was practicing linguistic paleontology.
Oh, that's a great term.
It's like he dug up the fossilized bones of a dead, forgotten word, figured out how its joints fit together, and built a living, breathing monster out of its skeleton.
That is precisely how his creative engine operated. In the 1930s, Tolkien became intellectually obsessed with an obscure Old English word found in ancient texts like the Codex Junius.
And what was the word?
The word was Sigilawara. At the time, early medieval English writers used it as a translation for the word Ethiopian, referring to dark-skinned people from the south.
Right.
But Tolkien, being a philologist, looked at that and wondered why the Anglo-Saxons would use this specific, very strange compound word to describe something they barely understood.
So he takes out his linguistic scalpel and cuts the fossil in half to see what's inside.
Exactly. He amended the word slightly to Sigil Harwan. Breaking it down, he determined that the first half, Sigil, meant both sun and jewel.
Okay.
Then he looked at the second half, Hirwa, and linked it to the Old English word for hearth, and tracing it further back, connected it to the Latin concept of soot.
Sun jewel and hearth soot.
Yes. And from that deep etymological dive, he theorized that before it was ever used as a translation for a real-world group of people, the word originally described a mythic, forgotten class of demons. Demons with red-hot eyes that emitted terrifying sparks and faces as black as hearth soot.
Sun and soot.
Yeah.
Flame and shadow. That is the literal blueprint for the Balrog.
It really is.
He resurrected a dead monster from the syllables of an Old English dictionary. And what's wild to me is that this one single word didn't just inspire the Balrog.
Right, there's more.
If Sigil means sun and jewel, that is the direct inspiration for the Silmarils, the holy glowing jewels that drive the plot of his entire First Age mythology. And the original medieval translation of Ethiopian inspired the Haradrim, the fierce men from the southern deserts of Middle-earth.
Yep.
One obscure word spawned 3 massive foundational pillars of his universe.
It just shows how intertwined his academic life and his fiction were. And he was also weaving in threads from broader Northern European mythology.
Like what?
Well, in Norse myths, one of the ancient epithets for the god Odin is Belegrir, which translates to fire-eyed. You also have the Norse fire giant Surt, who carries a deadly, flaming whipping stick.
Oh, a whip.
Exactly. And from the Old English epic Beowulf, you have the iconic monster Grendel, who's described as intensely, brutally physical, but also vaguely belonging to a different order of being a malevolent, creeping shadow.
Wow, so when Aragorn describes the Balrog to the rest of the Fellowship, he uses almost the exact same conceptual framework, right? He calls it both a shadow and a flame, strong and terrible.
Yes. And it wasn't just ancient words that built this narrative, it was ancient history, too. There's this fascinating theory by a literary scholar named Alexander Bruce comparing Gandalf's fight on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm to a real-world military disaster.
Which one?
The Battle of Maldon in 991 AD.
Okay, I don't know that one.
Well, Tolkien was intimately familiar with the Old English poem detailing the Battle of Maldon, and he had very strong critical feelings about the leadership displayed there.
Interesting.
In that historical battle, an English commander named Byrhtnoth made a massive tactical error driven purely by aristocratic pride. He essentially let an invading Viking army safely cross a narrow stone causeway over the water just so they could have a fair and glorious fight on open ground.
Oh, no.
Yeah. As a result of this misplaced chivalry, the English army was completely slaughtered, Byrhtnoth was killed, and England was forced to pay humiliating tribute.
So Bruce's theory is that Tolkien wrote the Moria Bridge scene as a kind of literary course correction. Byrhtnoth arrogantly lets the enemy cross a narrow bridge for his own glory and dooms his people. Gandalf, conversely, selflessly, stands his ground on a narrow bridge, absolutely refuses to let the enemy pass, sacrifices his own life, and saves his friends.
It operates as a redemption of the heroic ideal. Gandalf exhibits true, selfless leadership, contrasting sharply with Byrhtnoth's self-serving desire for personal glory.
That's amazing.
Through his fiction, Tolkien is essentially having a philosophical debate with a 1,000-year-old poem about what true courage actually looks like.
Okay, so we have this incredibly deep, linguistically rich, historically resonant monster built from the ground up by an Oxford professor.
Yes, we do.
But when you hand that nuanced monster over to the modern world, well, things get messy. Because we absolutely have to talk about the wings.
Oh, boy.
The wings.
Why are we so obsessed with giving the Balrog giant bat wings? I mean, if it's already a giant, soot-black, flaming shadow demon wielding a magma whip, isn't that scary enough without turning it into a giant bat? You have just stepped into what is arguably the most fiercely debated, volatile topic in the entire Tolkien fandom. Do Balrogs have wings?
People get really mad about this, right?
They do. The problem stems entirely from the fact that Tolkien's text is notoriously and perhaps deliberately ambiguous during that bridge sequence.
Okay.
When describing the Balrog's approach, he writes that the darkness surrounding it reached out like two vast wings.
Like two vast wings, that is clearly a simile.
It is.
It's just poetic language describing the shape of the magical shadow it projects.
But then, just a few paragraphs later, in the heat of the action, he writes, "Its wings spread from wall to wall." Now, the phrasing sounds completely literal. Add to that the fact that in the early lore, they had to ride on the backs of dragons to get around, which heavily implies they couldn't fly themselves.
That's true.
And when Gandalf throws Durin's Bane off the mountain peak, the text says it plummets and falls in ruin. It doesn't just catch the wind and fly away.
Right.
Because of this textual evidence, early Tolkien illustrators like Ted Naismith usually drew them as incredibly terrifying, completely wingless beings of fire.
But then Hollywood got its hands on the property, and the visual demands of cinema completely changed the creature's anatomy.
Exactly. Think about how we design monsters visually versus how we describe them in literature.
It's totally different.
A suffocating shadow is a terrifying concept to read on the page, but in a 1978 animated cartoon or a 2001 live-action movie, a shapeless, magical shadow just looks like bad cinematic lighting.
Yeah, you can't film that.
Directors needed a visual shorthand for demonic. Historically, Western culture has always used giant bat wings to signify fallen angels and demons. So adding wings wasn't necessarily just a misreading of the text. It was a cinematic necessity to instantly communicate ancient dread to a theater audience.
And it worked entirely too well. Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film gave the Balrog these massive wings.
Yep.
And then, in 2001, Peter Jackson brought the Balrog to live action, using the iconic conceptual designs of illustrator John Howe. And that Balrog definitely had massive physical wings.
And that cinematic choice completely cemented the visual standard in the global public consciousness.
Oh, for sure.
Just as Peter Jackson's films standardized the pop culture idea that All elves have significantly pointed ears, which is actually another heavily debated topic in the text, by the way.
Don't even get me started on the ears.
The films made the winged Balrog the definitive, undisputed version for most people.
And from there, the Balrog's pop culture footprint just spirals entirely out of control. It becomes the ultimate archetype for the final dungeon boss.
It really does.
Like the very early editions of the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons literally included a monster explicitly called a Balrog, right alongside hobbits and ents.
It didn't last long.
No. The Tolkien estate actually brought a lawsuit against them, forcing the creators of D&D to hastily rename their giant fire demon the Balor, borrowing a name from Irish mythology instead to avoid copyright infringement.
The cultural reach of this specific design is staggering. You find echoes of the Balrog everywhere, like the Australian psychedelic rock band King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard has a frantic, heavy song on their 2017 album simply called The Balrog.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it describes a giant, reanimated fire demon destroying everything in its path.
That is amazing. And my absolute favorite pop culture oddity. In the classic 2004 indie video game Cave Story, there's a recurring antagonist named Balrog. But he doesn't look like a winged fire demon at all.
What does he look like?
The developer famously designed him to look like a giant anthropomorphic bar of soap.
A bar of soap.
Yes, he just runs around the screen yelling his catchphrase, "Huzzah!" It's the most delightfully absurd, chaotic journey from a terrifying, primordial, angelic spirit of destruction to a literal block of soap.
That is wild.
So what does this all mean? When we look at this whole bizarre, sprawling journey, how do we sum up the legacy of this creature?
Well, if we synthesize all of these threads, the Balrog is far more than just a generic fantasy monster waiting at the bottom of a dungeon. It is an absolute masterclass in world building.
It really is.
It starts as a brilliant linguistic riddle, a philologist looking at the Old English word sigilwara and wondering what fears it originally communicated. From there, it evolves in the author's mind from a common, destructible foot soldier into a breathtakingly rare, fallen angelic spirit of immense power.
Yeah.
It embodies medieval historical critique, ancient Norse mythology, and deep theological concepts regarding how evil corrupts and traps the soul. And finally, it transcends its own text to become a permanent, universally recognized cultural icon of dread.
It really makes you realize that the next time you consume any piece of media, whether you are reading a classic fantasy novel, watching a blockbuster movie, or playing a video game, you should remember that the most terrifying, visceral monsters usually have the most fascinating, meticulous histories hidden away in the creator's notebooks. The fear you feel isn't just ink on a page. It's a carefully constructed psychological trap built from centuries of human language, ancient myth, and historical tragedy.
But you know, that deep history raises one final important question, though a lingering thought for you to ponder regarding the mechanics of this world.
Okay, lay it down.
We established earlier that, as Mare, Balrogs are fundamentally immortal spirits. Only their physical form, the raiment of the world, can be destroyed.
Right.
When they invest their dark power into that terrifying fiery shape, they lose the ability to shift forms. So when Gandalf threw Durin's Bane down the freezing side of Xeraxagil and utterly broke its physical body in ruin, wait, let me phrase that better, what actually happened to its spirit?
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that.
The physical vessel of soot and flame is gone, yes, but the immortal, formless essence of that ancient demon wasn't destroyed. It can't be.
So it's just out there.
Is that spirit still lingering there on the mountain, completely powerless to ever take a physical shape again, but fully conscious? Just a malevolent, invisible will trapped in the dark corners of the world, furious and waiting.
That is chilling.
It is certainly something for you to think about the next time you find yourself alone in the dark.